The Second World War was the most destructive conflict in human history, reshaping the world forever. It spanned continents, engaged millions of soldiers and civilians, and altered the course of the 20th century. By the late 1930s, the world was on the brink of war. The Treaty of Versailles had left Germany humiliated after the First World War, while Japan was determined to expand its empire in Asia. The rise of fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany, combined with the aggressive imperialism of Japan, set the stage for global conflict. By May 1939, the Rome-Berlin-Tokyo axis, as it was known, were united in the Anti-Comintern Pact to fight the spread of communist ideals from the Soviet Union, and came together in what was called the Pact of Steel. Hitler had been pushing ahead with his territorial designs, starting with claims on German-speaking lands. But his book, Mein Kampf, had already laid claim to something bigger and yet more ominous: Lebensraum, or living space. Having already taken over Austria, Hitler went on to demand the German-speaking parts of Czechoslovakia, the Sudetenland. The Western Allies were unwilling to go to war for Czechoslovakia. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain believed that Hitler could be appeased by giving in to some of his demands. Czechoslovakia was made to hand over the Sudetenland in 1938. Appeasement proved to be a disaster. Hitler occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia in March 1939. Hitler next demanded the city of Danzig, an additional territory from Poland. The Western Allies promised to help Poland. In September 1939, after years of rising tension, Germany invaded Poland, prompting Britain and France to declare war. The Second World War had begun. Germany's blitzkrieg strategy, meaning lightning war, combined speed, surprise, and overwhelming force. Tanks, aircraft, and infantry moved rapidly, striking hard and fast. Poland was quickly overrun, marking the start of a new kind of war that would soon engulf Europe and the rest of the world. After Poland, the war in Europe focused on the Western Front. In May 1940, Germany launched a full-scale invasion of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Within weeks, Paris fell, and France was forced to surrender. The British, cornered at Dunkirk, staged a desperate evacuation, saving over 300,000 soldiers. Germany and its allies now held all of Western and Central Europe, with the exception of Switzerland. Britain stood alone. Under Winston Churchill's leadership, Britain refused to surrender. In the summer of 1940, the German Luftwaffe launched the Battle of Britain, an intense bombing campaign aimed at destroying the British Royal Air Force and forcing Britain to negotiate. But British pilots, aided by radar technology, successfully defended the skies. Terror bombing of British cities was not yielding results. It was only strengthening the resolve of the British public to fight back. The British Navy and Air Force kept the island safe, while the immense British Empire around the globe provided resources to fight on. Churchill had gone from sideline politician in peacetime to a fierce wartime leader, whose determination was infectious. His speeches encouraged British people to believe in victory, despite the apparent German supremacy on the continent. I have, myself, full confidence that if all do their duty, if nothing is neglected, and if the best arrangements are made, as they are being made, we shall prove ourselves once again able to defend our island home, to ride out the storm of war, and to outlive the menace of tyranny, if necessary for years, if necessary alone. Unable to invade Britain across the English Channel, Hitler's forces turned elsewhere. While Britain held on in the west, the Eastern Front was about to become the most brutal theater of the war. In June 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, a surprise attack on the Soviet Union, and so began a massive invasion of the Soviet Union, aiming to crush communism and seize territory for German expansion. This was the largest invasion in human history, It was to become a titanic clash between fascism and communism as ideological and political systems. Hitler had hoped that the Soviet Union was weak after Stalin's purges of state, society, and the military in the 1930s. German thinking assumed that the Soviet people were opposed to their leadership and would respond passively or even cooperate with the German invaders. They have only to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down, Hitler had declared confidently. Initially, the German army advanced rapidly, capturing millions of Soviet soldiers and encircling key cities like Leningrad and Moscow. But the Soviets under Joseph Stalin would not be defeated easily. At the very beginning, the Germans discovered something alarming about this enemy. The Soviet soldier often fought to the death. Stalin drew upon patriotism just as much as communist ideology in the fight to defend the USSR. While German propaganda described the war in the East as a great crusade against Asiatic and Bolshevik barbarians, the Soviet people saw their war as a struggle for life itself. It was described as a great patriotic war and a sacred war in the Soviet Union. The Germans were not prepared for Russian winter. By December 1941, fierce Soviet resistance and the intense cold had halted the German advance at the outskirts of Moscow. A winter counteroffensive by the Soviets regained ground. In summer, the Germans would push forward again. In the north, Soviet defenders held on to Leningrad, under siege by the Germans and Finns. Enduring terrible starvation for months on end, the defenders of Leningrad endured the largest siege in human history. And despite immense suffering, the city did not fall. By late 1942, the tide was turning. In the Battle of Stalingrad, one of the bloodiest battles in history, Soviet forces encircled and defeated the German Sixth Army. It marked a turning point on the Eastern Front. Meanwhile, in North Africa, British and Commonwealth forces clashed with German and Italian troops under the command of General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. Germany had gotten involved in the fighting in North Africa to help its Italian allies invade the British colonial possessions there, ultimately aiming to cut off the Suez Canal, a vital artery linking Britain to its colonial possessions like the Raj in South Asia. The North African campaign was a tug of war, with Rommel gaining ground, but ultimately being defeated by British General Bernard Montgomery at El Alamein in 1942. After North Africa, the Allies turned their attention to Italy. In 1943, British and American forces landed in Sicily and mainland Italy, toppling Mussolini's regime and forcing Italy to surrender. However, German troops continued to fight fiercely, turning Italy into a brutal and costly battleground. In the Pacific, Japan had been expanding its empire since the early 1930s, occupying parts of China and Southeast Asia. On the 7th of December 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the US naval base at Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States into the war. Japan's early successes in the Pacific were staggering. They quickly captured key territories, including the Philippines, Singapore, and Indonesia. The United States, under General Douglas MacArthur and Admiral Chester Nimitz, faced a daunting task to turn the tide against an aggressive and well-prepared enemy. In June 1942, the US achieved a decisive victory at the Battle of Midway, sinking 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. This marked a turning point in the Pacific. From this moment, American forces began their strategy of island hopping, capturing key islands on the way to Japan. One of the bloodiest campaigns occurred on Guadalcanal, where both sides suffered heavy losses. Throughout the Pacific theater, the fighting was fierce and the conditions brutal. The Japanese military fought with extraordinary tenacity, often resorting to suicidal infantry attacks, which the Allies came to call banzai charges. By 1944, the Japanese had developed kamikaze tactics for aircraft, where pilots would crash their planes into enemy ships in suicide attacks. But as the Americans advanced, the strategic bombing of Japan began to weaken the Japanese home front. The Second World War saw unprecedented technological and strategic advancements. The development of tanks, aircraft, submarines, and radar reshaped modern warfare. The Germans perfected blitzkrieg tactics, combining speed and mechanized units, while the British and Americans developed advanced bombers to strike deep into enemy territory. One of the most significant technological breakthroughs was the development of the atomic bomb. The United States, under the top-secret Manhattan Project, harnessed nuclear power to create the deadliest weapon ever conceived. In Europe, Germany's V-2 rocket technology marked the beginning of missile warfare, though it was too late to change the outcome of the war. Behind the battlefronts, the economies of the major powers were transformed to support the war effort. In the United States, factories shifted from producing consumer goods to manufacturing tanks, planes, and weapons. Women entered the workforce in record numbers, symbolized by Rosie the Riveter, as millions of men went to fight overseas. In the Soviet Union, industrial cities were relocated from the front lines, and the USSR's ability to continue producing tanks and weapons under immense pressure was a crucial factor in their eventual victory. Meanwhile, Britain relied on US aid through the Lend-Lease program, which supplied vital resources like food, oil, and equipment. Germany, though initially benefiting from its conquest of Europe, struggled with overextension. As the war dragged on, shortages of fuel and raw materials crippled the German war effort. Japan faced similar economic challenges, particularly after the US blockade severely restricted access to vital resources like oil and rubber. The war wasn't just fought by soldiers, it touched the lives of civilians across the globe. In Britain, the Blitz saw German bombs rain down on London and other cities, with civilians enduring nightly air raids. In the Soviet Union, civilians faced the horrors of the siege of Leningrad, while starvation claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. In the United States, the war brought unity, but also led to injustices like the internment of Japanese Americans, who were forcibly relocated to camps. Propaganda played a significant role in maintaining morale and encouraging citizens to contribute to the war, whether by buying war bonds, rationing food, or conserving materials. As the war turned against the Axis powers, civilians in Germany and Japan bore the brunt of Allied bombing campaigns. The firebombing of Dresden and Tokyo caused massive civilian casualties, while the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought the war in the Pacific to a devastating close. In 1944, the Allies opened a second front in Europe with the D-Day landings in Normandy. As American, British, and Canadian forces pushed from the west, Soviet troops advanced from the east. By May 1945, Berlin fell, and Hitler, the architect of the war, committed suicide. Germany surrendered, ending the war in Europe. In the Pacific, the war ended in the most destructive way possible. On the 6th and 9th of August 1945, the US dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The devastation was unimaginable. Japan surrendered days later, marking the end of the Second World War. The war reshaped the global order. Over 60 million people died, entire cities were destroyed, and the world was left in ruins. From the ashes, a new world order emerged. The United States and the Soviet Union rose as superpowers, setting the stage for the Cold War. The United Nations were established to promote peace and prevent another global conflict. European nations finally had to start giving up their colonies in Asia and Africa after the Second World War. A dangerous new era was about to begin, with the threat of nuclear annihilation looming over the world, as the US-led Western Bloc and the Soviet-led Eastern Bloc began to compete for world dominance.